The boy hit the porch, bleeding from 3 places: his shoulder, his ribs, his left hand where 2 fingers used to be. He was 13, maybe younger, and he'd run 5 miles through fire and darkness with his sister's name on his lips. Coleman Briggs was halfway through his second whiskey when the kid collapsed against the doorframe, gasping like a dying animal. "Sir," the word came out wet broken. "If they come, hide my sister. Please." Coleman's hand stopped midway to his glass. Behind the boy, smoke rose black and thick above the cottonwoods. Another farm burning, another family erased. The war had taught Coleman many things, but the most important was, this evil doesn't stop until someone makes it stop. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the end of this story. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. Now, let's begin. Done. Coleman set the glass down without drinking. The boy's eyes were rolling back, blood pooling beneath him on the wooden planks Coleman had laid himself 3 years ago, when he'd sworn he was done with violence, done with other people's wars. The kid's shirt was torn open, a gash across his chest, still pumping red with each struggling heartbeat. "How many?" Coleman asked. The boy's mouth worked soundlessly. "How many men?" "5." It came out as a whisper. "Maybe 6. They got badges. Said they was federal. But they ain't. They killed my daddy. They killed—" His voice cracked. "Mama tried to hide us in the root cellar. They found us anyway. Lizzie ran. I told her to run." Coleman was already moving. He grabbed the boy under the arms, dragged him inside, kicked the door shut with his boot heel. The kid weighed maybe 90 pounds, soaking wet, all bone and terror. Coleman laid him on the table, swept aside 3 days' worth of plates, and the leather holster he'd been meaning to oil. "Your sister, where is she?" "Creek, the cottonwood with the broken branch. I told her wait there till I came back, or till sunrise, whichever came first." The boy's hand shot out, grabbed Coleman's wrist with surprising strength. "Don't let them take her. Please. They do things. Bad things." Coleman knew exactly what kind of things men like that did. He'd seen it in Missouri and Kansas during the war, when uniforms stopped meaning anything, and the only law was who had the most guns and the least conscience. He'd seen farms like this one, burning children, like this one bleeding. He'd told himself he was done. He'd told himself he'd paid enough in blood and sleepless nights. He pulled a sheet from the closet, tore it into strips. "What's your name?" "Ethan. Ethan Garver." "Well, Ethan Garver, you did good. You got here. You stayed alive. Now I need you to keep doing that while I go get your sister." "They'll kill you. There's too many." Coleman wrapped the boy's shoulder, pulled it tight enough to make him gasp. "I've been killed before. Didn't take." He wasn't sure if that was meant to be a joke, but the boy didn't laugh. Coleman grabbed his rifle from above the mantel, checked the magazine, by habit 15 rounds clean action scope, sighted 2 weeks ago, on a coyote that had been harassing his chickens. He pulled his coat on, then his hat. At the door he turned back. "Ethan, you see anyone come through that door that ain't me or a little girl, you take the pistol in the drawer beside you, and you shoot them. You understand?" The boy nodded, eyes wide. "I mean it. Don't wait. Don't ask questions. Just shoot." Coleman stepped into the night. The air tasted like ash. Wind pushed smoke across the valley in thick curtains, turning the moon into a red smear barely visible through the haze. East of his property, maybe 3 miles, orange flames still ate at something, the Garver farm most likely. He could smell burning hay, burning wood, the sick, sweet stench of livestock that hadn't made it out of the barn. Coleman moved fast down the slope toward the creek rifle, ready, every sense alive in a way it hadn't been since he'd left the uniform behind. His boots found the path by memory. He'd walked it 1,000 times. Checking traps, fishing, thinking. Trying not to think. The cottonwood stood where it always had, massive and ancient, its broken branch pointing toward the water like an accusing finger. Lizzie Garver. Coleman called, not loud, just enough. Your brother sent me. My name's Coleman Briggs. Nothing. Ethan's bleeding pretty good, but he's alive. He's at my cabin. I'm going to take you there, but I need you to come out now. Still nothing. Smart girl. Don't trust the first voice you hear. Coleman lowered himself to one knee, set the rifle across his thighs. Your brother said you'd be here. Said you ran when he told you to. Said you're brave. I'm guessing you're also smart enough not to trust strangers, which means you're probably wondering if I'm one of the men who killed your folks. He paused. Let the words settle. I'm not. But those men are coming, and when they get here, hiding won't be enough. A sound, small choked, came from somewhere in the roots of the tree. Coleman waited. A moment later, a girl crawled out from beneath the massive trunk, her dress torn, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her eyes found Coleman's huge and dark in the moonlight, and she didn't say a word, just stared at him, like she was trying to decide if he was real or another nightmare. Coleman stood slowly, hands visible. You did real good, Lizzie. Your brother's proud of you. I'm proud of you. Now we need to move. Are they coming? Her voice was so small, it almost broke him. Yeah, they're coming. Are you going to kill them? Coleman looked at this child, this little girl who'd watched her parents murdered, who'd run through fire and darkness on her brother's command, who'd hidden alone in the roots of a tree, waiting for either salvation or death. I'm going to stop them, he said. That's all you need to know. She nodded once, then walked to him and took his hand. Her fingers were ice cold. They made it halfway back to the cabin when Coleman heard the horses. He stopped, pulled Lizzie behind him, listened. 4 animals, maybe 5, moving slow through the scrub oak west of the creek. Not hurrying, not worried. Men who knew nobody was coming to stop them, who'd done this enough times to know. The patterns: burn the farm, kill the parents, hunt the children. Simple. Efficient. Profitable if you were the kind of man who sold children to the kind of people who bought them. Coleman's jaw tightened. We're going to run now, he whispered to Lizzie. You stay behind me. You don't stop. You don't look back. When we get to the cabin, you go straight inside. Understand? She nodded. They ran. The cabin appeared through the smoke lamp still burning in the window where Coleman had left it. The horses were closer now, their riders talking in low voices, confident, unhurried. Coleman hit the porch, yanked the door open, pushed Lizzie inside. Ethan was sitting up at the table, the pistol in his good hand pointed directly at the door. When he saw his sister, something in his face collapsed and rebuilt itself simultaneously. Lizzie. Later. Coleman cut him off. He crossed to the window, pulled the curtain aside an inch. 5 horses, 5 men. They'd stopped at the edge of his property line, silhouettes against the burning horizon. One of them dismounted, walked forward a dozen paces, studying the cabin. Coleman Briggs. The voice carried across the distance, loud and jovial, like they were old friends meeting at a church social. That you in there? Coleman said nothing. Now don't be rude, Coleman. We know you're home, saw the lamp, saw you running with something small and precious. We're looking for 2 children, property of the federal government, you understand. Wards of the state after their parents' unfortunate accident. We're here to collect them, legal and proper. The man took another step forward. Moonlight caught his face, lean, weathered, a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. He wore a duster and a hat with a silver band, and on his chest a badge that probably came from a dead marshal somewhere. My name's Garrett, the man continued. Maybe you've heard of me. We do recovery work. Runaways, thieves, orphans. Anyone who needs collecting. Now I'm guessing those Garver children found their way to your door, and I'm guessing you, being a good Christian man, took them in. But see, that makes you an accessory, harboring fugitives. That's a hanging offense in some territories. Coleman stepped away from the window, looked at Ethan and Lizzie. The boy had wrapped his arm around his sister, the pistol still in his free hand, shaking slightly from blood loss or fear or both. You two get in the bedroom. There's a trunk against the wall. Move it. You'll find a trapdoor underneath. It leads to a root cellar, then to a tunnel. Tunnel comes out about 50 yards north in the ravine by the old well. You get there, you keep running north. Don't stop till you hit the river. There's a town on the other side. Find the sheriff. Tell him Coleman Briggs sent you. What about you? Ethan asked. I'll be right behind you. You're lying. Coleman met the boy's eyes. Yeah, I'm lying. Now move. Ethan stood wincing, holding his sister's hand. At the bedroom door, he turned back. Why? Why what? Why are you doing this? You don't know us. Coleman checked his rifle, ejected the magazine, slapped it back in. I know them, he said quietly. That's enough. The children disappeared into the bedroom. Coleman heard the trunk scraping across the floor, heard the trapdoor creak open. Good. He turned back to the window. Garrett was still standing there, waiting patient as death. Coleman opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Well now. Garrett smiled. There's the man himself. Coleman Briggs. Late of the Union Army, unless I'm mistaken. Sharpshooter if the stories are true. Did some wet work for Colonel Hammond in the Kansas campaigns. Retired yourself out here trying to forget. How am I doing so far? You're on my land, Coleman said. You need to leave. See, I'd love to do that. But we got a job to finish. Those children belong to us now. Their parents died in debt, owed money to some very important people. The kids are payment. You understand how it works. Their parents didn't owe anyone anything. You murdered them and burned their farm. Garrett's smile didn't waver. Well, that's a matter of perspective, isn't it? Point is, we're taking those kids. You can hand them over peaceful, or we can burn you out like we did the Garvers. Your choice. Coleman raised his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it, but enough. There's a third option. And what's that? You ride away, now, while you still can. Garrett laughed a genuine delighted sound. Oh, I like you, Coleman. I really do. But see, there's 5 of us and 1 of you. And we're on a schedule. He gestured to the men behind him. Boys, light it up. One of the riders produced a torch already burning. Another pulled a bottle from his saddlebag, kerosene probably, or lamp oil. They were going to burn him out. Exactly like they'd done to the Garvers. Exactly like they'd done to how many other families across how many territories. Coleman's finger found the trigger. Last chance, he said. Garrett looked at him, still smiling. You know what I think? I think you're bluffing. I think you're a tired old soldier who just wants to be left alone. I think you'll hand over those kids because you know you can't stop us, and you'd rather live than die for someone else's brats. Coleman thought about that. Thought about the boy bleeding on his table, begging him to hide his sister. Thought about the little girl in the roots of the tree, her hand ice cold in his. Thought about all the farms burning, all the children screaming, all the men like Garrett who wore false badges and real smiles and never faced consequences because no one stood in their way. You're wrong, Coleman said, and shot the man with the torch. The rifle's report shattered the night. The torch fell. Fire bloomed in the dry grass. The other 4 men scattered, yanking their horses around, grabbing for their own weapons. Coleman fired again, working the bolt action like breathing, each shot precise, each shot a decision. A rider went down his horse screaming. Another dove from his saddle rolled, came up shooting. Bullets stitched the porch, the cabin wall, the doorframe beside Coleman's head. He dropped behind the railing, fired blind through the wooden slats, heard someone curse. The fire was spreading now, racing through the autumn dry scrub pushed by wind, turning the night orange and hellish. Garrett was yelling orders, his voice sharp and commanding. Flank him! Get around the back! Burn him out! Coleman crawled inside, slammed the door, dropped the bar across it. He ran to the bedroom. The trunk was shoved aside, the trapdoor opened, darkness below. The children were gone. Good. Glass shattered in the front room. Something heavy hit the floor, rolled a bottle, flames spilling from a rag stuffed in its neck. Fire caught the rug, the chair, the curtains. Smoke poured in immediately, thick and choking. Coleman grabbed the bed frame, dragged it across the floor, braced it against the bedroom door. He dropped through this trapdoor, pulled it shut above him, plunged into darkness. The root cellar smelled like earth and potatoes and old fear. Coleman had built it the first month he'd owned the cabin, back when he still had nightmares about enemy soldiers overrunning his position, about needing a way out. He moved by touch, found the tunnel entrance, crawled forward on hands and knees through dirt and roots and spiderwebs. Behind him, above him, the cabin burned. He could hear it, the roar of flames consuming everything he'd built, everything he'd tried to become after the war. 3 years of peace, of solitude, of pretending he could leave violence behind. All of it burning because he'd made a choice. Because a bleeding boy had stumbled onto his porch and he'd said yes instead of no. He didn't regret it. The tunnel opened into the ravine. Coleman pulled himself out, gasped fresh air, looked back. His cabin was an inferno now, flames reaching for the stars, smoke pouring into the sky. He could see shadows moving around it. 4 men now, maybe 3. The fire had driven them back, but they'd regroup. They'd hunt. "Mr. Briggs?" Coleman spun rifle up. Ethan and Lizzie stood in the shadow of the old well, exactly where they were supposed to be. The boy still had the pistol, still had his arm around his sister. "I told you to run," Coleman said. "You said you'd be right behind us. We waited." Coleman wanted to argue, wanted to yell at them for not following orders, for putting themselves in danger. But looking at them, this boy who'd run 5 miles with 3 wounds and missing fingers, this girl who'd hidden alone in terror because her brother told her to, he realized they'd already made their choice too. "All right," he said. "Then we run together." They moved north into the darkness, away from the burning cabin and the men with false badges and real guns. Behind them, Garrett's voice rose above the fire, shouting orders, promising violence. Coleman didn't look back. He'd lost his home tonight. He'd lost his peace. But as he ran through the darkness with 2 children who weren't his, but were now his responsibility, he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Purpose. The war had taught him how to kill. Now it was time to remember why. They ran for 20 minutes before Ethan collapsed. Not dramatically, not with warning. His legs just stopped working, and he went down face first into the dirt. Lizzie screamed, a sharp sound quickly swallowed by darkness and distance. Coleman dropped beside the boy, rolled him over, checked for bleeding. The makeshift bandage on his shoulder had soaked through, red and wet. "I'm okay," Ethan gasped. "Just give me a second." "We don't have a second." Coleman looked back toward where the cabin had been. Orange glow still lit the sky, but fainter now, farther. The fire had probably consumed everything by now. Everything he owned, everything he'd built. He pushed the thought away. "Can you walk?" "I can run." "That's not what I asked." Ethan tried to push himself up. His arm shook, gave out. He tried again with the same result. His face twisted with frustration and shame. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Coleman made a decision. He handed his rifle to Lizzie. "You know how to carry this." She nodded, took it with both hands. It was nearly as tall as she was. "Don't touch the trigger. Don't point it at anyone unless I tell you to. Understand?" "Yes, sir." Coleman pulled Ethan up, got the boy's arm across his shoulders, took most of his weight. The kid was light, but dead weight was always heavier than it looked. "We keep moving. River's maybe 2 miles north. We make it there. We cross, we find help." "What if they catch us first?" Lizzie asked. "They won't." "But what if—" "They won't." Coleman repeated harder this time and started walking. Lizzie followed the rifle, dragging slightly in the dirt behind her. They moved slower now, much slower, and every sound made Coleman's neck tighten. The wind through the grass. An owl somewhere in the darkness. His own breathing, too loud, too ragged. Ethan's weight increased with each step as the boy's consciousness flickered. "Stay with me," Coleman said. "Tell me about your family." "What?" "Your parents. Tell me about them." Ethan's head rolled against Coleman's shoulder. Why? Because I want to know. And because talking keeps you awake. The boy was quiet for a dozen steps. Then, Pa was a farmer, corn mostly, some wheat. He was teaching me, said I had good hands for it. Ethan's voice caught. Mama made bread. Best bread in the territory. She'd sell it in town sometimes. People would line up. Sounds like good people. They were. Ethan's breathing hitched might have been a sob or just exhaustion. Garrett came 3 days ago. Said Pa owed money to someone in Kansas City. Pa said that was a lie. He'd never borrowed from anyone. Garrett said it didn't matter what Pa thought, said the debt was real and documented and legal. Said if Pa didn't pay, they'd take the farm. Pa told him to get off our land. And they came back. Tonight. After dark. 6 of them. They didn't knock. They just broke down the door. Pa tried to fight. He had his rifle, but he didn't even get it raised before. Ethan stopped walking, stopped talking, just stood there with his weight on Coleman trembling. Keep going, Coleman said gently. Keep walking. Keep talking. Mama screamed. She pushed us toward the cellar, told us to hide. But one of them, the big one with the beard, he grabbed her. Pa tried to stop him, and they shot Pa. Just shot him, like it was nothing. Like he was nothing. The words came faster now, urgent, desperate to escape. Lizzie ran. Mama told her to run, and she did. I tried to help Mama, but another one hit me with his gun. Hit me twice. I went down. Then the house was burning, and I knew Mama was still inside, and I couldn't get to her. I had to find Lizzie. I had to keep her safe. That's what Pa would have wanted. That's what Mama would have wanted. Coleman felt the boy shaking against him, felt rage building in his own chest, cold and focused. You did exactly right. You saved your sister. That took more courage than anything else you could have done. I left her there. I left Mama there. Your mother was already gone. You know that. You should have saved your sister, which is what you did. Coleman shifted. Ethan's weight kept moving. Your parents died protecting you too. Don't make that sacrifice meaningless by dying out here because you feel guilty for surviving. They walked in silence after that. The land rose and fell in gentle swells, scrub oak giving way to pine as they climbed into higher country. Coleman's legs burned, his back screamed. The boy's weight seemed to double with each step, but he didn't stop, didn't slow. Behind them, still visible when he glanced back, the glow of fire painted the horizon. Not just his cabin anymore. The whole prairie was catching now dry grass and drought-starved brush, creating a wildfire that would burn for days. Good, Coleman thought. Let it burn. Let it buy them time. There, Lizzie said suddenly. I hear water. Coleman stopped, listened. She was right. The sound of running water, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere ahead in the darkness. The river. They'd made it. He pushed forward with renewed energy, half carrying Ethan down a slope through a stand of cottonwoods, and suddenly they were at the bank. The river ran fast and dark, maybe 40 feet wide, deeper than Coleman would have liked. On the far side, lights flickered the town, small but real, meaning help, meaning safety. Coleman eased Ethan down against a tree. Can you swim? The boy shook his head. Never learned. What about you? Coleman asked Lizzie. A little. Pa taught me last summer in the creek. Coleman studied the river. Fast current, cold water, darkness. If they tried to swim, Ethan would drown. If they didn't cross, Garrett would find them. The fire would slow the riders, but not stop them. Eventually they'd circle around, pick up the trail, run them down. Coleman had maybe an hour, maybe less. All right, he said. New plan. You two stay here. I'm going to cross, get to town, bring back help. Sheriff, deputies, anyone willing to ride out with guns. No. Ethan's hand shot out, grabbed Coleman's wrist with surprising strength. You leave us. We're dead. Soon as you're gone, they'll come. And we can't fight them. Look at me. He held up his ruined hand, 2 fingers missing the stumps, wrapped in dirty cloth. I can't even hold a gun properly anymore. Coleman looked at this boy, this 13-year-old child who'd lost his parents, lost his home, lost parts of his body, and was now sitting in the dirt beside a river in the middle of nowhere, terrified and bleeding, and still trying to be brave. Listen to me, Coleman said quietly. Those men back there, they're going to come, and when they do, I can fight them, or I can run with you, but I can't do both. If I fight, I need you safe across this river. If I run, they'll just keep chasing us until we're too tired to run anymore, and then they'll take you both. So I cross now, get help, come back. That's the only way this ends with you alive. What if you don't come back? Lizzie asked. Her voice was small, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent. What if they kill you? Or what if the town doesn't believe you? What if no one comes? Then you wait until morning. You cross this river on your own, and you tell anyone who'll listen what happened. You tell them about your parents. You tell them about Garrett and his men. You make enough noise that someone has to pay attention. We're children, Ethan said bitterly. No one pays attention to children. Coleman reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper, his discharge papers from the Army signed by Colonel Hammond himself, bearing the official seal. He'd kept them for 3 years, hadn't looked at them once. You show them this. You tell them Coleman Briggs sent you. You tell them I was a sharpshooter for the Union, and I saw what Garrett did, and I'm willing to testify. You tell them that. He pressed the papers into Ethan's good hand. The boy stared at them like they were made of gold. Why are you doing this? Ethan asked again. You keep risking everything for us. Why? Coleman stood, checked his rifle, looked back toward where fire still glowed on the horizon. Because once, a long time ago, someone did it for me. And I swore if I ever got the chance, I'd pass it on. He looked down at the children. I'm keeping that promise now. He turned toward the river. Mr. Briggs, Lizzie said. They're here. Coleman spun. Riders, 5 of them emerging from the tree line 50 yards back. They'd spread out, circling, boxing them against the river. No more talking. No more negotiations. Garrett sat his horse in the center, that same easy smile on his face, even in darkness. Well now, Garrett called. That was a good run, Coleman. Better than most. But it's over. You got nowhere left to go. River at your back, us in front. You're a smart man. You know how this ends. Coleman raised his rifle, sighted center mass on Garrett's chest. Same way it did at the cabin. You killed 2 of my boys back there. That's going to cost you. But I'll tell you what, I'm a reasonable man. You hand over those children, walk away, I'll let you live. Hell, I'll even pay you for your trouble. Say, $100. That's more than fair for one night's work. They're not for sale. Everything's for sale, friend. You just haven't heard the right price yet. Garrett's smile widened. 200. Cash. Right now. You take it, disappear, forget this ever happened. Those kids were going to die anyway. At least this way you profit from it. Coleman's finger tightened on the trigger. I've got a better offer. You ride away, now I let you live. Garrett laughed. So did his men. The sound echoed across the water, cruel and confident. You got 1 rifle and maybe 15 rounds. We got 5 rifles, 5 pistols, and all night. Do the math, soldier boy. I did. Coleman pulled the trigger. The shot took Garrett's horse in the chest. The animal screamed, reared through its rider. Garrett hit the ground hard, rolled, came up cursing. His men scattered, some dismounting, others circling wide to flank. Coleman worked the bolt, fired again, laying down suppressing fire that kept them moving, kept them from getting set. Into the water! Coleman shouted at the children. Now! But we can't! Move! Ethan grabbed his sister, dragged her toward the river. Coleman fired twice more, heard someone scream. Saw a muzzle flash as one of Garrett's men returned fire. The bullet whipped past his ear, close enough to feel. He dropped, rolled, came up shooting from a new position. Another rider went down his horse, galloping away riderless into the darkness. The river was chaos. Lizzie was in the water, screaming, the current already pulling at her. Ethan stood at the edge, frozen terror written across his face. He couldn't swim. He was going to drown or get shot, and either way, he was going to die. Coleman made a choice. He fired his last 3 rounds in rapid succession, not aiming, just creating noise and fear and confusion, then threw the rifle aside and ran. He hit Ethan at a full sprint, wrapped both arms around the boy and jumped. The water was ice. It punched the air from his lungs, filled his boots, dragged at his coat. The current grabbed them immediately, spinning them, pulling them under. Coleman fought for the surface, pulled Ethan's head above water. The boy thrashed, panicked, dragging them both down. Coleman got an arm under his chin, kicked hard, broke surface again. "Stop fighting," Coleman gasped. "Let me pull you." Gunfire erupted from the shore. Bullets churned the water around them, impossibly loud, impossibly close. Coleman kicked harder, angling downstream using the current. Somewhere ahead, Lizzie's head bobbed in and out of view. She was swimming, barely more drowning than anything, but moving toward the far shore. Ethan went limp in Coleman's arms. For a terrible second, Coleman thought he'd been shot. Then he realized the boy had just passed out, his body finally giving up after hours of trauma and blood loss. Dead weight, now truly dead weight, pulling them both toward the bottom. Coleman's feet found river stones. Not the far shore yet, but a sandbar, shallow water enough to stand. He dragged Ethan up, gasping, coughing, looked back. Garrett and his remaining men were on the near shore, reloading, preparing to enter the water themselves. 3 of them left now, maybe 4. Hard to tell in darkness and chaos. "You can't run forever," Garrett screamed across the water. "I will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Those children are mine. You hear me? Mine." Coleman didn't waste breath answering. He pulled Ethan toward the far shore, found Lizzie there, already collapsed on the bank, vomiting water. He dragged them both up into the tree line, into cover, into darkness. Behind them, splashing, the riders entering the water following. "Come on," Coleman gasped. "Keep moving." "I can't," Lizzie sobbed. "I can't run anymore." "Yes, you can." Coleman hauled Ethan up again, got him balanced. "Because if you don't, they win. And I did not lose my home, my peace, and nearly drown in a river so those bastards could win. Now move." She moved. They climbed the slope away from the river, through pine forest branches whipping at their faces. Coleman's legs were rubber. His arms felt like they'd been beaten with hammers. Water poured from his clothes, his boots. Ethan's blood had started flowing again, leaving a trail in the darkness that anyone could follow. The town's lights were closer now, maybe half a mile. Close enough to smell wood smoke, to hear a dog barking, to imagine safety. But half a mile might as well be 50 if they couldn't walk it. Coleman's vision was starting to tunnel black, creeping in from the edges. Blood loss or exhaustion, or both. He'd been shot, he realized dimly. Somewhere in the chaos at the river, one of those bullets had found him. Left side low, not immediately fatal, but bleeding steady. He kept walking, kept climbing, kept pulling Ethan, kept checking to make sure Lizzie was still behind him. Voices in the darkness. Garrett's men closer than they should be, spreading out hunting. They had dogs now, or they were just that good at tracking. Either way, the chase was ending. Coleman's strength was ending. The distance between them and safety was too far, and the distance between them and death was too close. They broke from the trees into a clearing. A cabin sat there, dark and silent. No smoke from the chimney, no horses in the yard. Abandoned maybe, or its occupants asleep. Coleman didn't care. He made for the door. Shouldered it open. Dragged the children inside. The interior was empty. Not abandoned. Someone lived here recently. There were still coals in the fireplace, still food on the shelves. But whoever they weren't home. Coleman barred the door, checked the windows. 2 in front, 1 in back, all with shutters that could be closed and latched. He did that, plunging them into absolute darkness. "Lizzie, find candles, matches, anything." He heard her moving, heard things falling, heard her breathing harsh and scared. A match flared. Candlelight bloomed. The cabin was small, one room simple. A bed against one wall. A table with 2 chairs. Shelves with canned goods and a few books. And leaning in the corner, beautiful and impossible, a rifle. Coleman grabbed it, checked the action. Loaded 5 rounds recently cleaned. He checked the shelves, found a box of ammunition, started loading his pockets. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped half the rounds. "Mr. Briggs," Lizzie whispered, "you're bleeding." "I know. It's bad. I know that too." He moved to the window, peered through a crack in the shutters. Shadows moved in the forest, 3 of them converging. They knew where he was. They were just taking their time now, enjoying it, confident in the outcome. Coleman turned to the children. Ethan was unconscious on the floor, his breathing shallow. Lizzie stood beside him. Her dress soaked her face pale, her eyes too old for her age. "Under the bed," Coleman said. "Both of you. Get under there and don't come out until I say, or until you hear friendly voices. If you hear shooting, you stay quiet. If you hear me die, you still stay quiet. Eventually someone will come. This cabin belongs to someone. They'll come home. You tell them what happened. You show them those papers. You make them listen." "Please don't die," Lizzie said. Coleman almost smiled. "I'll do my best." She pulled her brother under the bed, squeezed in beside him. Coleman threw a blanket over the edge, hiding them. Then he positioned himself at the window, rifle ready, and waited. He didn't wait long. The door shook as someone tested it. Found it barred. Tested it again harder. "Coleman Briggs." Garrett's voice muffled, but clear. "You made this harder than it needed to be. Cost me good men. Cost me time. Cost me money. That's all coming out of those children's hides now. You understand. Whatever was going to happen to them just got a whole lot worse because of you." Coleman said nothing. "You in there alone? You send those kids out through a back window, you playing hero, buying them time to run." Garrett laughed. "Doesn't matter. We'll find them. We always do. But you I'm going to kill slow. You earned that." The front window exploded inward, not gunfire, an axe wielded by one of Garrett's men chopping through the shutter through the frame. Coleman fired through the opening, heard a scream, saw the axe fall away. He worked the bolt, fired again, as another face appeared, fired a 3rd time, as the door started splintering. They were coming from multiple directions, coordinated, professional. These weren't just killers. They were soldiers, or had been men who knew tactics and violence. The door burst open. Coleman spun, fired, hit someone's center mass. The man went down. Another came through, diving low, rolling. Coleman's shot missed, punched a hole in the wall. The man came up with a pistol, fired twice. Coleman felt something burn across his shoulder, threw himself sideways, worked the bolt, fired from the ground. The man's head snapped back. He dropped. Coleman scrambled to his feet, dizzy, his vision swimming. 2 down, 1 left plus Garrett. Maybe. Hard to think. The wound in his side was worse than he'd thought. The new one on his shoulder was bleeding freely. He was leaving puddles on the floor. Movement at the back window. Coleman spun, fired through the shutter. Wood exploded outward. Someone cursed, retreated. Coleman worked the bolt. Click. Empty. He dropped the rifle, grabbed the dead man's pistol, checked it. 3 rounds left. 3 rounds against 2 men. Bad odds. Terrible odds. But he'd survived worse. Barely. Garrett appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the night, his own pistol drawn and ready. "You done?" Coleman raised the pistol. His hand shook badly. "Not yet. You can't even stand straight. Look at you. You're bleeding from 4 places. You probably can't even see clearly anymore. Put the gun down. I'll make it quick." "Where's your last man?" "Around back, covering the window. You got nowhere to go, Coleman. It's over." Coleman's vision blurred, cleared, blurred again. The floor seemed to tilt beneath him. He was dying. He knew that. Knew it with the same certainty he'd known anything in his life. The only question was whether he died before or after Garrett took the children, whether his sacrifice meant anything or was just another pointless death in a world full of them. "Why?" Coleman asked, not playing for time, genuinely wanting to know. "Why children? You were a soldier once, I can tell. You had honor. What happened?" Garrett smiled, but there was no humor in it now. Just weariness. "Same thing that happened to you probably. The war ended. They sent us home with nothing. No pay, no pension, no prospects. Just memories and nightmares. I did what I had to do to survive, same as you." "No," Coleman said. "Not the same. I chose silence. You chose this. And look where silence got you." Garrett gestured at the blood, the bodies, the ruined cabin. "Dead in a stranger's house, dying for children you don't even know. Was it worth it?" Coleman thought about Ethan stumbling onto his porch, bleeding and desperate. Thought about Lizzie hiding in the roots of that cottonwood tree. Thought about the choice he'd made to stand instead of hide, to fight instead of turn away. "Yeah," he said. "It was." He fired. So did Garrett. Both men fell. Coleman hit the floor hard, the pistol skittering away from nerveless fingers. His chest felt like someone had driven a spike through it. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. Could barely see. Across the room, Garrett wasn't moving either, a dark stain spreading beneath him. Coleman thought distantly. "We killed each other. That's almost funny." Boots on the porch. The last man coming to check. Coming to finish the job. Coleman tried to move, couldn't. Tried to call out a warning to the children, couldn't. Could only lie there and watch as the last of Garrett's men stepped through the doorway, pistol drawn, looking for survivors. The man saw Coleman, started to raise his gun. Then stopped. Just stood there frozen, staring at something Coleman couldn't see. The pistol lowered. The man's face twisted with some emotion Coleman couldn't read in his dying vision. "Jesus," the man whispered. "Just Jesus." He turned and walked out. Coleman heard his boots on the porch, heard a horse being mounted, heard hoofbeats fading into distance. Running. The last man was running. Coleman tried to understand why. Failed. Too tired. Too much blood gone. The darkness was pulling at him, gentle and insistent, promising rest. He'd held them off. The children were safe. That was enough. That had to be enough. "Mr. Briggs." Lizzie's voice small and scared. She crawled out from under the bed, stood over him, her face swimming in and out of focus. Behind her, Ethan, barely conscious, leaning against the wall. "You have to run now," Coleman tried to say. Wasn't sure if actual words came out. "Town. Find help." "I already did." Coleman's vision cleared just enough to see past her through the broken door to where lights were approaching through the darkness. Torches. Lanterns. People. A lot of people. "When you were fighting," Lizzie said, tears streaming down her face, "I went out the back window. I ran to town. I told them men were killing people. I told them you needed help." She knelt beside him, took his hand. "I told them you were dying for us. And they came." Coleman wanted to say something, wanted to tell her she was brave, that she'd done exactly right, that her parents would be proud. But the darkness was too strong now, pulling him down, and all he could do was squeeze her hand once before the world went away completely. He didn't hear the sheriff arrive. Didn't hear the townspeople surround the cabin. Didn't hear them find Garrett dead and his last man gone. Didn't hear the doctor arguing that moving him would kill him, and the sheriff arguing back that leaving him would do the same. Coleman heard nothing at all. Coleman woke to pain. Not the sharp, immediate pain of being shot, but the deep, grinding ache of a body that had been torn apart and stitched back together. His chest felt like someone had packed it with broken glass. His shoulder throbbed, his side burned. Every breath was a negotiation with agony. He opened his eyes. White ceiling, sunlight through a window, clean sheets that smelled like lye soap, Not dead then. Probably. You're awake. A woman's voice, matter-of-fact, unsurprised. About time. Coleman turned his head slowly, everything moving like it was underwater. A woman sat in a chair beside the bed, maybe 40, gray threading through her dark hair, hands folded in her lap. She had the look of someone who'd seen enough suffering that one more body on a bed barely registered. How long? Coleman's voice came out like gravel scraping over stone. 5 days. You died twice. Doc brought you back both times. He's not sure if that was mercy or cruelty yet. Coleman processed that. 5 days. The children. Alive? Safe. The boy's recovering. Lost those fingers for good, but the wounds are clean. The girl hasn't left the building. She sleeps in the hallway outside this room. We tried to give her a bed, but she refused. The woman stood, poured water from a pitcher, held the cup to Coleman's lips. Small sips. Your stomach's forgotten how to work. The water was the best thing Coleman had ever tasted. He took 3 small sips, wanted more, but the woman pulled it away. That's enough for now. Who are you? Martha Glenn. This is my boarding house. You're in room 3. You've been dying in my room 3 for 5 days, bleeding on my sheets, scaring my other guests. When you're well enough, we'll discuss compensation. Despite everything, Coleman almost smiled. Fair enough. The sheriff wants to talk to you. I've been keeping him away, but he's getting insistent. Says there's questions about what happened. Says there's bodies that need explaining. Martha set the cup down, looked at Coleman directly. Did you kill those men? Yes. Did they deserve it? Yes. Then as far as I'm concerned, that's the end of it. But Sheriff Harlan might see things differently. He's a good man, but he's cautious, doesn't like complications. She moved to the door. I'll tell him you're awake. What you say to him is your business. But those children out there, they've been through enough. Whatever story you tell, make sure it doesn't end with them losing someone else. She left before Coleman could respond. He lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to think through the fog of pain and whatever drugs the doctor had given him. 5 days. Garrett was dead. His men were dead or scattered, but that didn't mean it was over. Men like Garrett didn't work alone. They had employers, partners, people who'd paid for those children and would want their investment returned. The door opened again. A man entered, 50-something, wearing a badge and a troubled expression. Sheriff Harlan, presumably. He pulled the chair closer to the bed, studied Coleman like he was a puzzle with missing pieces. Mr. Briggs, I'm glad you're alive, even if it does complicate things. How does my living complicate things? Because dead men can't testify, and testimony is what we need right now. Harlan leaned forward. I've got 4 bodies. 3 at a burned-out cabin that I'm told was yours. 1 at Ben Morrison's place where you made your last stand. I've got witnesses who say you killed them all. I've got 2 children who say those men murdered their parents, burned their farm, hunted them like animals. I've got your service record, which tells me you're capable of exactly what happened. What I don't have is proof that those men deserved killing. They wore badges. False ones. I checked with the federal marshal's office. No one by the name of Garrett, or matching his description, works for them. No legal warrants for the Garver children. No documentation of any debt owed by their parents. Harlan rubbed his face, tired. So on paper you killed 4 men who might have been just ordinary criminals. That's murder unless we can prove otherwise. Coleman's chest tightened, and not from the wound. You're saying I'm under arrest. I'm saying I don't know what to do with you. Half this town thinks you're a hero. Other half thinks you're a killer who brought violence to a peaceful place. The Garver children are claiming you saved them, but children make poor witnesses, legally speaking. Their word alone won't stand up in court if this goes that direction. What about the last man? The one who ran? Gone. Vanished. We sent riders out, but he could be anywhere by now. If we find him, maybe he talks, maybe he doesn't. Maybe he corroborates your story. Maybe he spins his own version where you're the villain. Harlan stood paced to the window. I want to believe you, Mr. Briggs. Everything in my gut says you did the right thing. But the law isn't about gut feelings. It's about evidence and testimony and things I can prove in front of a judge. Coleman closed his eyes. After everything, the running, the fighting, the dying twice, it was going to end with him in a cell or at the end of a rope because paperwork didn't align properly. The irony was almost amusing. There might be another way, Harlan said slowly. The territorial governor is visiting 3 towns over in about 2 weeks. He's hearing petitions settling disputes, things like that. If I could present your case to him directly with witnesses, with the children's testimony, with your service record and character witnesses from people who know you, maybe he grants a pardon. Maybe he recognizes this as justifiable homicide under territorial law. Maybe. It's better than definitely hanging. Harlan moved back to the chair. But it requires you staying here, staying visible, staying cooperative. No running, no disappearing. You do that, I'll do everything I can to make this right. Coleman thought about the cabin burning about 5 days unconscious, about how every part of his body hurt. I'm not going anywhere. Good. Because those children need you. The boy keeps asking when you'll wake up. The girl refuses to talk to anyone but Martha. They've got no family left, no home, no prospects. The territorial orphanage is in Kansas City, but that's a hard place for children. I've seen what comes out of there. Harlan's voice dropped. They're safer with you if you'll have them. I don't have a home anymore. No, but you're alive. That's more than they had 2 days ago. And Martha says, once you're healed enough, there's work available. The sawmill needs men. The railroad's coming through next year, they'll need workers. A man with your skills could make a living here. A family could make a living here. Family. The word sat strange in Coleman's mind. He'd never thought of himself as family to anyone. The war had taught him that attachments were liabilities, that caring about people just gave the world more ways to hurt you. But lying here broken and exhausted, he thought about Ethan's face when he'd begged Coleman to hide his sister. Thought about Lizzie running to town for help when any sensible child would have hidden and waited. I'll think about it, Coleman said. You do that. Meanwhile, I'll start building your defense. Harlan stood, adjusted his badge. One more thing. That last man, the one who ran before he left, he went to the general store, bought supplies for a long ride. Store owner said he looked shaken. Said the man kept talking to himself, saying, just kids, they were just kids, over and over. Whatever he saw in that cabin, it changed something in him. He saw that killing children for money might have consequences. Maybe. Or maybe he saw something worth more than money. Either way, he's gone and we're here. Harlan moved to the door. Rest, Mr. Briggs. Get your strength back. We've got 2 weeks to convince a governor you're worth saving. The sheriff left. Coleman lay there processing. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to heal enough to stand trial, essentially in front of a man who had the power to decide whether Coleman lived or died. 2 weeks with 2 children depending on him, watching him, hoping he wouldn't abandon them like everyone else had. The door cracked open. Lizzie's face appeared tentative, scared. Mr. Briggs, Martha said you were awake. Come in. She slipped through, closed the door behind her. She looked smaller, somehow more fragile than she had during the fight. Her dress was different. Someone had given her new clothes, clean ones, proper ones. But her eyes were the same. Too old. Too knowing. How's your brother? Hurting. But he's alive because of you. She moved closer, stopped at the foot of the bed. The doctor says you shouldn't be alive. Says you lost too much blood, that your heart stopped twice, that most men would have quit. But you didn't quit. Neither did you. Running to town like that, getting help, that was brave. I was scared the whole time. Being scared and doing it anyway is what brave means. Coleman shifted, slightly winced, as pain shot through his chest. Lizzie, you understand what's happening, don't you? The sheriff explained. She nodded. They might put you in jail or worse, because you killed those men, because you saved us. That's not your fault. You know that, right? Whatever happens, it's because of choices I made. You made those choices for us. I made them for me too, because I couldn't live with myself if I hadn't. Coleman caught her eyes. Your parents loved you very much. What they did pushing you to run, making sure you survived, that was love. What I did was just paying that forward. Lizzie was quiet for a long moment. Then, Ethan wants to testify at the hearing with the governor. He wants to tell them what happened. I do too. You don't have to. Yes, we do. Because you stood up for us when no one else would. Now it's our turn to stand up for you. She moved closer, took his hand with both of hers. You said you'd rebuild. You said you'd make a home. Did you mean it? Coleman looked at this 8-year-old girl who'd lost everything, who'd survived things no child should survive, who was still finding the courage to hope. Yeah, he said quietly. I meant it. She smiled, small but real. Good, because Ethan and I, we don't have anywhere else to go. And you don't have anyone else either, so maybe we can be somewhere together. Before Coleman could respond, the door burst open. Ethan stumbled in his shoulder, bandaged his ruined hand wrapped in clean cloth. He looked better than he had 5 days ago, but still pale, still fragile. You're awake, Ethan said, breathless. Martha told me, but I didn't believe her, and I had to see for myself, and... He stopped, swallowed hard. You're really awake. So it seems. Ethan crossed to the bed, stood beside his sister. The two of them together, orphans bound by trauma and survival, looking at Coleman like he held all the answers. He wanted to tell them he didn't. That he was just a man who'd made a choice, who'd gotten lucky, who was now facing consequences he couldn't predict or control. Thank you, Ethan said simply. For everything, for fighting, for not giving up, for being willing to die for us. I'm not dead yet, Coleman said. Might be premature to thank me. No, even if things go bad with the governor, even if they take you away, I want you to know what you did mattered. You gave us a chance. That's more than anyone else did. Coleman felt something crack in his chest, and this time it wasn't from the bullet wound. These children, these resilient, courageous children, were trying to comfort him, trying to tell him it was okay if he'd sacrificed everything as long as they survived. The weight of that, of their faith, their gratitude, their hope, was almost too much to bear. Listen to me, Coleman said, his voice rougher than intended. Both of you. What happened at your farm, what your parents did, what I did, none of it should have been necessary. You shouldn't have had to run. Your mother shouldn't have had to die protecting you. Your father shouldn't have been murdered for standing up to criminals. The world isn't supposed to work like this. But it does, Ethan said flatly. The world is exactly like this. I know that now. The world is like this because people let it be, because they turn away when they see evil, because they choose comfort over justice, because they decide someone else's children aren't worth the risk. Coleman met their eyes. Your parents didn't turn away. I didn't turn away. And now you two have a choice. You can let what happened break you, make you bitter and hard and untrusting. Or you can use it. You can become the kind of people who stand up when others won't, who fight for people who can't fight for themselves, who make the world a little less dark just by refusing to let the darkness win. Is that what you did? Lizzie asked. After the war? No, Coleman admitted. I hid. I ran. I built a cabin in the middle of nowhere and tried to pretend the world's problems weren't mine anymore. Took your brother bleeding on my porch to remind me that hiding isn't living, that peace you don't fight for isn't really peace at all. And now I fight. However long I've got left, whether it's 2 weeks or 50 years, I fight. For you two, for anyone else who needs it. Because that's the only way this ends with meaning. Ethan nodded slowly. Then we'll fight too. We'll tell the governor everything. We'll make him understand. And if he doesn't, the boy's jaw set. Then we'll figure something else out. Together. Coleman wanted to argue, wanted to tell them they were children, and shouldn't have to fight, shouldn't have to carry this burden. But looking at them, he realized they weren't children anymore. Trauma had stolen that. Garrett had stolen that. The world had stolen that. All Coleman could do now was make sure their strength turned into something good, instead of something bitter. Together, Coleman agreed. The door opened again. Martha stood there, hands on hips, expression stern. Out. Both of you. The man needs rest, not visitors wearing him down with talk of governors and fighting. Shoo. The children left reluctantly, Lizzie squeezing Coleman's hand once more before Martha ushered them out. The woman approached the bed, checked Coleman's bandages with practiced efficiency, adjusted his pillows. "You've got those kids believing in happy endings," Martha said quietly. "Hope you're prepared to deliver on that." "I don't know if I can." "Then you better learn fast, because those two out there, they've tied their futures to yours. You fail, they fail. You give up, they give up. That's how children work. I didn't ask for this responsibility. No one ever does. It finds you anyway." Martha finished her inspection, stepped back. "My husband died 10 years ago. Cholera outbreak. Left me with this boarding house and 3 children to raise alone. I didn't ask for that either. But you do what needs doing because the alternative is letting everything fall apart. Your children. Grown now. 2 out east, 1 married to a rancher south of here. They're good people because I made sure of it even when I was exhausted and broke and ready to quit." Martha's expression softened slightly. "Those Garver children are good people too. Don't waste that." She left before Coleman could respond. Alone again, he stared at the ceiling and thought about the path that had led here. A cabin burned, men killed, 2 orphans who'd become his responsibility, a governor who'd decide his fate, 2 weeks to heal enough to face judgment, 2 weeks to figure out how to turn survival into something like redemption. The days passed slowly. Coleman's body healed with the stubborn resilience that had kept him alive through the war, through a dozen battles that should have killed him. The doctor, a thin, nervous man named Pemberton, changed bandages twice daily, muttering about miracles and fool's luck. Martha brought meals that Coleman couldn't eat, water he drank in tiny sips, medicine that tasted like punishment, but dulled the pain enough to sleep. The children visited every day. Ethan would sit in the chair Martha had occupied that first day, talking about nothing and everything, about how the town was treating them with careful kindness, like they were made of glass, about the boarding house cat that Lizzie had adopted, about his hand, how the missing fingers hurt, even though they weren't there anymore. Phantom pain, Doc Pemberton called it. Your body remembering what was lost. Lizzie brought him things. A book she'd found in the boarding house library about the Lewis and Clark expedition. A smooth stone from the river washed clean. A drawing she'd made of 3 figures standing in front of a small house, smoke rising from the chimney. She didn't explain what it meant. She didn't have to. Sheriff Harlan visited twice. The first time he brought Coleman's discharge papers returned from some territorial office where they'd been verified. The second time he brought news. Governor's coming in 10 days instead of 2 weeks. Some political thing changing his schedule. That's good for us, means less time for opposing forces to organize. Opposing forces. Garrett's employers. Took some digging, but I found them. Kansas City syndicate running everything from gambling houses to other ventures. The kind that depend on children no one's looking for. They've got lawyers, Coleman. Good ones. They're claiming you murdered their legal recovery agents who were retrieving stolen property. The children aren't property. Tell that to their contracts. Apparently Garrett had papers claiming the Garver parents signed over custody as debt payment. Forgeries, obviously, but it's their word against ours, and their lawyers are already here sniffing around taking depositions. Coleman felt cold spreading through his chest. They're going to win, aren't they? Legal technicalities, paperwork, money. That's how men like them always win. Not always. I've been talking to people building our case. The townspeople, they remember Garrett. He came through here 6 months ago, took a farmhand's daughter, claimed she was indentured. Family never saw her again. Another time 3 years back, similar thing. There's a pattern. If I can prove Garrett was a criminal, that his operation was illegal, then you killing him becomes justifiable. If, Harlan agreed grimly. But I'm good at finding proof. Give me 10 days. 8 days later, Coleman could stand. Barely. He made it from the bed to the window before his legs threatened to give out, but it was progress. From the window, he could see the town. Small frontier, typical wooden buildings along a main street, church steeple at one end. Peaceful. The kind of place where nothing happened, and people liked it that way. He'd brought war to them. Blood and fire and death. Some of them would forgive it seeing the children safe. Others wouldn't. Martha was right. He'd complicated their peace, and consequences had to be paid. The night before the governor's arrival, Coleman couldn't sleep. The wounds ached despite the medicine. His mind ran circles around tomorrow, around what he'd say, how he'd explain. Around the possibility that he'd saved these children only to abandon them anyway, locked in a cell, or worse. A soft knock at the door. Coleman turned from the window. "Come in." Ethan entered fully dressed despite the late hour. His hand was still bandaged, but he carried himself stronger now, more solid. Growing into the trauma, Coleman thought grimly. Learning to bear weight that should never have been his. "Couldn't sleep either?" Ethan asked. "Seems to be going around." The boy moved to the other side of the window, looked out at the same view Coleman had been studying. "I've been thinking about what you said. About choosing what kind of person to become after. After everything. And I want to be like you. Someone who stands up. Someone who fights." Ethan's jaw tightened. "But I'm scared, Mr. Briggs. Scared that tomorrow they'll take you away. Scared that Lizzie and I will be alone again. Scared that everything you did won't matter because some lawyer has better paperwork." Coleman had no comfort to offer, no reassurances that rang true. "Fear means you understand the stakes. That's not weakness. Doesn't feel like strength. It's not supposed to. Being strong isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing what needs doing anyway." Coleman put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Tomorrow, you and your sister are going to tell the truth. All of it. What happened at your farm, what Garrett did, what you saw. That's all you can do. That's all any of us can do. What if the truth isn't enough? Then we'll deal with what comes next. Together." Coleman met Ethan's eyes. "I made you a promise, kid. To rebuild. To make a home. I intend to keep that promise whatever it takes. Even if it means running. If the governor rules against you." Coleman had thought about it. About taking the children and disappearing into the territories, changing names, starting over somewhere no one would find them. It was possible, maybe even smart. "No," he said quietly. "No more running. Running is how men like Garrett win. How they operate for years without consequences. I stand and face this legal and proper. And when I win, not if when we rebuild right here, in the open. Where everyone can see that standing up works, that justice is possible, that good people don't have to hide from bad ones." Ethan looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "When, not if." "That's right. I'll tell Lizzie. She's been crying in her room thinking you're going to jail. I'll tell her you said when." Ethan moved to the door, paused. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs, for believing it's possible." After the boy left, Coleman stood at the window until dawn colored the eastern sky. He thought about battles, about the war, about all the times he'd been certain he was going to die, and somehow hadn't. About luck and providence, and the thin line between them. Tomorrow would decide everything. Either he'd walk out free, able to keep his promise, able to build something good from the ashes of violence. or he'd lose, and the children would learn the hard lesson that sometimes good men lose and bad ones win. Coleman refused to let that be the lesson. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever the governor decided, Coleman would make sure these children learned something different. That standing up mattered, that fighting was worth it, that sometimes, even when the odds were impossible, good could win. He just had to survive long enough to prove it. The governor arrived at noon with an entourage that seemed too large for a town this size. 3 carriages, a dozen mounted guards, clerks carrying boxes of documents. The whole thing rolled down Main Street like a circus coming to town, and half the population turned out to watch. Coleman observed from Martha's window, still too weak to stand for long, but refusing to lie down. Ethan stood beside him, silent and tense. "That's a lot of people," Ethan said. "Governors travel heavy, makes them feel important. Are you scared?" Coleman considered lying, decided against it. "Yeah, I'm scared." "Good," Ethan said, echoing Coleman's words from the night before. "Means you understand the stakes." Despite everything, Coleman smiled. The boy was learning. Sheriff Harlan came for them an hour later. He looked tired, like he'd been up all night preparing. Probably had been. "Governor's set up in the church. Says it's the only building large enough for proper proceedings. We're scheduled for 2 o'clock. You ready?" Coleman wasn't sure he'd ever be ready. His chest still ached with every breath. His left arm hung stiff, the shoulder wound not fully healed. Walking more than 50 feet left him dizzy and gasping. But ready or not, time was up. "Let's go." Martha insisted on helping him dress. A clean shirt borrowed from someone. His own pants washed and mended where bullets had torn them. His boots dried and oiled. She worked in silence, efficient and careful, until Coleman was presentable, if not respectable. "You look like a man who's been through hell," Martha said, stepping back to examine her work. "I have been through hell." "Good. Let them see it. Let them see what standing up costs." She handed him a walking stick, sturdy oak. "Don't be proud. Use this. Limping into that church will tell them more than any speech about what you sacrificed." The walk to the church took 15 minutes and felt like 15 miles. Coleman leaned heavy on the stick, Ethan on one side, Lizzie on the other, both children helping without being asked. The whole town seemed to be watching. Some faces were friendly. Others weren't. Coleman understood both reactions. The church was packed. Every pew filled, people standing along the walls, more crowded in the doorway. At the front, behind the pulpit that had been moved aside, sat Governor William Thatcher, a broad-shouldered man of about 60, with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. To his right, 3 lawyers in expensive suits looking bored and confident. To his left, Sheriff Harlan and the town mayor, a nervous little man named Perkins. Coleman made his way down the center aisle. Every eye followed him. Every whisper quieted. By the time he reached the front, the church was silent enough to hear breathing. "Mr. Coleman Briggs." Governor Thatcher's voice was deep measured, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. "I understand you've caused quite a stir in our territory." "Yes, sir." "I also understand you're claiming justifiable homicide in the deaths of 4 men. That's a serious claim." "Yes, sir." "Before we proceed, I want to be clear about what's happening here. This is not a trial. I don't have the authority to try you for murder. That would require a territorial court, a jury, months of process. What I can do is hear testimony, examine evidence, and make a determination about whether formal charges should be filed. If I believe you acted within the law, I can issue a finding of justifiable homicide which effectively ends the matter. If I believe otherwise, I remand you to the territorial marshal for prosecution. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Do you wish to have legal representation? I can appoint someone if needed." Coleman looked at the 3 lawyers sitting confident and smug to the governor's right. They represented money power, the kind of influence that bent laws to convenience. Against that, what chance did he have? "No, sir, I'll speak for myself." "Very well." Thatcher opened a folder, pulled out papers. "I've read the initial reports from Sheriff Harlan. I've read your military service record, which is impressive. I've also read the complaints filed by representatives of the Kansas City Trade Association who claim you murdered their lawful agents in the course of their duties." He looked up. "We'll hear from them first. Mr. Dalton, you have the floor." One of the lawyers stood smoothing his jacket. He was young, maybe 30, with slicked hair and a practiced smile. "Thank you, Governor. My name is Richard Dalton, representing the KCTA and the estates of the deceased. The facts of this case are simple. My clients employed several men, including the late Mr. Garrett, to recover 2 children who were lawfully indentured to offset debts incurred by their parents. These men carried proper documentation, operated under legal authority, and were murdered by Mr. Briggs when they attempted to fulfill their duties." "What documentation?" Coleman asked. Dalton turned, still smiling. "I'm speaking, Mr. Briggs. You'll have your turn." "Let him ask," Thatcher said mildly. "This is an inquiry, not a courtroom. We're after truth, not procedure." Dalton's smile tightened. "The documentation includes a signed contract between the Garver parents and my clients agreeing to indenture their children for a period of 10 years in exchange for settlement of outstanding debts totaling $800. "Can I see it?" Coleman asked. Dalton produced a paper, handed it to Governor Thatcher, who examined it briefly before passing it to Coleman. The document looked official enough. Stamped signatures, legal language. But Coleman had seen forged documents during the war. Whole units operating under false orders, deserters carrying fake discharge papers. He knew what to look for. "This is dated 6 months ago," Coleman said. "But the paper's new, not 6 months old." "How can you tell?" Thatcher asked, interested. "The edges. New paper is sharp clean. Old paper shows wear discoloration, especially if it's been carried in someone's pocket or saddlebag. This paper is fresh, probably written last week." Dalton's smile vanished. "That's speculation." "It's observation. I can also tell you the signature is wrong." Coleman pointed at the bottom of the document. "Says here John Garver signed it. But the J is wrong, too elaborate. I saw John Garver's handwriting on a letter in his burned farmhouse. He wrote plain simple. This is someone trying too hard to look official." "You examined the crime scene," one of the other lawyers interjected. "Isn't that tampering with evidence?" "I found a letter in the ashes," Coleman said, "written by John Garver to his brother in Missouri. I kept it because I thought it might matter." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded, singed paper. "Here, compare the signatures." Thatcher took both documents, held them side by side, studied them. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "These do look different." "Handwriting can change over time," Dalton said quickly. "Circumstances stress age." "Not this much," Thatcher interrupted. "I'm not a handwriting expert, but I've seen enough signatures to know these weren't written by the same person." He set the papers down. "Continue with your testimony, Mr. Dalton, but understand I'm already skeptical of your documentation." Dalton rallied, but Coleman could see cracks forming in that polished confidence. Regardless of the contract's authenticity, the fact remains that Mr. Briggs killed 4 men. Even if Garrett's authority was questionable, murder is murder. "Self-defense isn't murder," Coleman said. "Self-defense requires imminent threat. You had multiple opportunities to retreat to seek help from authorities to avoid confrontation. Instead, you chose violence." "I chose to protect 2 children from men who'd already murdered their parents and burned their home." "So you claim. But where's your proof? Where are the witnesses to this alleged murder? Where's the evidence that Garrett did anything wrong before you shot him?" Coleman turned to Sheriff Harlan. "You said you found proof about Garrett's past." Harlan pulled papers from his own folder. "I sent telegrams to every town within 300 miles. Asked about Garrett, about missing children, about suspicious activity. Got responses from 17 towns. In 11 of them, families reported children disappearing after visits from men matching Garrett's description. In 4 cases, there were witnesses who identified Garrett by name. In 2 cases, there were bodies parents killed when they tried to resist." "Hearsay," Dalton said. "None of that proves anything about what happened here." "It proves pattern," Thatcher said. It proves Mr. Garrett was not the legitimate recovery agent you're claiming him to be. He looked at the lawyers. Unless you have better evidence, I'm inclined to dismiss your complaint entirely. The third lawyer stood older than Dalton, harder around the edges. Governor, with respect, even if Garrett was a criminal, that doesn't give Mr. Briggs the right to execute him and his associates. This is a matter for law enforcement, not vigilante justice. I agree, Thatcher said. Which is why we're going to hear from the children. They're the only witnesses to the initial crime. Their testimony will determine whether Mr. Briggs acted reasonably or exceeded his authority. He gestured to Ethan. Young man, please approach. Ethan stood walking to the front with his bandaged hand hanging at his side. He looked small standing before the governor, small and young and damaged. But his voice was steady when he spoke. My name is Ethan Garver. I'm 13 years old. 6 days ago, men came to my farm and killed my parents. Can you describe what happened? Thatcher asked gently. They came after dark. 6 of them. They broke down our door. Pa asked what they wanted. The man in charge, Garrett, said we owed money. Pa said that was a lie. Garrett said it didn't matter that they were taking us anyway. Pa tried to stop them. They shot him. Just shot him. Mama pushed us toward the root cellar, told us to hide, but one of them grabbed her. I tried to help, but another one hit me with his gun, hit me twice. I fell down. When I got up, the house was on fire. I found Lizzie outside. We ran. They chased us. How did you get injured? Thatcher indicated Ethan's hand. The boy held up the bandaged stumps where 2 fingers had been. One of them caught me in the woods, had a knife. Said he was going to cut pieces off until I told him where Lizzie was hiding. Started with my fingers. I didn't tell him. Eventually I got away. Ran to Mr. Briggs's cabin. The church was absolutely silent. Even the lawyers looked uncomfortable. Why Mr. Briggs? Thatcher asked. Because his cabin was closest. And because... Ethan paused, swallowed hard. Because Pa had told me once that if we ever needed help, real help, Coleman Briggs was a man who'd fought in the war and understood about standing up to evil. Pa respected him, even though they'd only met a few times. Coleman hadn't known that. Hadn't known John Garver even knew his name, much less respected him. The weight of it settled heavy in his chest. What happened when you reached the cabin? Thatcher prompted. I begged him to hide Lizzie, told him men were coming. He didn't hide her. He went and got her, brought her back, then stood between us and them. When Garrett came, Mr. Briggs refused to hand us over. They threatened to burn him out. He told them to leave. They didn't. So he fought. Did he fire first? Yes, sir. But only after Garrett's men lit torches to burn the cabin. Only after they gave him no choice. Dalton stood again. The boy's testimony is understandably biased. He sees Mr. Briggs as a savior. That doesn't make his actions legal. Sit down, Mr. Dalton. Thatcher said, an edge in his voice now. I'll determine what's relevant. He turned back to Ethan. What happened after the cabin burned? Ethan recounted it all. The run through darkness, the river crossing, the final stand at the abandoned cabin. He spoke clearly, precisely, leaving nothing out. When he described Coleman being shot, described watching him fall, his voice wavered, but didn't break. Thank you, Thatcher said when Ethan finished. You've been very brave. You can sit down now. No, sir, Ethan said. I have something else to say. Go ahead. Those lawyers, they keep talking about law and evidence and proper authority, but none of that mattered when my parents were being murdered. None of that mattered when I was running through the dark with my sister, scared we'd be caught and sold to whoever paid Garrett's employers. The law didn't save us. Law didn't even know we existed. Mr. Briggs saved us. He risked everything when he didn't have to. When it would have been easier and safer to turn us away. And now these men want to punish him for it. Ethan's voice rose, anger breaking through. If that's how law works, if that's how justice works, then something's broken. Because good men shouldn't be punished for doing good things. He sat down abruptly, shaking. Lizzie immediately wrapped her arms around him. Coleman wanted to do the same, but couldn't move. couldn't breathe properly. The boy's words echoed in the silent church. Thatcher was quiet for a long moment, studying papers, studying faces, studying the room. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Dalton, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Did your clients know that Garrett was a killer and a kidnapper when they employed him?" "Of course not." "Direct answer, counselor. Yes or no?" Dalton exchanged glances with his colleagues. "We can't speak to our client's knowledge of—" "That's not a denial." Thatcher leaned forward. "I've been governor of this territory for 8 years. I've seen men like your clients before. Men who operate in shadows, who use legal language to justify illegal acts, who profit from human suffering while keeping their hands technically clean. I've also seen men like Coleman Briggs, men who stand up when everyone else turns away. And I'll tell you something, I prefer the company of the latter." "Governor." The older lawyer stood. "With all due respect, your personal preferences aren't relevant to— My personal preferences decide your case." Thatcher interrupted. "That's how this works. I listen to evidence, testimony, arguments, and then I make a judgment based on what I believe serves justice. Not what serves your client's profits, not what serves legal technicality, justice." He picked up the forged contract, held it up. "This document is fraudulent. The testimony from Sheriff Harlan establishes a clear pattern of criminal behavior. The children's testimony establishes that Garrett and his men were murderers and kidnappers. Everything Mr. Briggs did was in defense of innocent lives against criminals operating under false authority." "You can't just—" Dalton started. "I can, and I am. This inquiry is concluded. My finding is as follows." Thatcher stood, and the whole church stood with him out of reflex. "Coleman Briggs acted in justifiable defense of 2 minor children against criminal actors who posed an imminent threat to their lives and freedom. No charges will be filed. No further action will be taken against him. Furthermore, I'm issuing a warrant for the arrest of anyone connected to the Kansas City Trade Association who can be proven to have knowledge of or involvement in Garrett's activities. Sheriff Harlan, I'm authorizing you to work with territorial marshals on this matter." The lawyers were talking over each other now, objecting, protesting, threatening appeals. Thatcher ignored them all, looking directly at Coleman. "Mr. Briggs, you're free to go. What you did took courage most men don't have. This territory needs men like you." He paused. "It also needs men who understand that justice works best when it works through proper channels. You did what was necessary in the moment. But going forward, I expect you to work with law enforcement, not around them. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Coleman managed. "Good. Now get out of here. You look like you're about to fall over." The church erupted. People talking, shouting, some cheering, some angry. The lawyers were gathering their papers, faces red with fury. Sheriff Harlan was grinning like he'd won a war. And Coleman was standing there slightly dizzy, trying to process that it was over. Actually, over. Ethan grabbed his hand. "You're free. You're really free." "We're free," Coleman corrected. "All 3 of us." Lizzie crashed into him, nearly knocking him down, wrapping her arms around his waist and holding on like she'd never let go. Coleman steadied himself with the walking stick, his other hand on her head, and felt something in his chest that wasn't pain, wasn't fear. Something lighter that he'd almost forgotten the name of. Hope, maybe. Or just the absence of certain death. Outside the church, the afternoon sun was too bright. People crowded around, some congratulating, some asking questions, some just staring. Coleman ignored them all, focused on walking on, staying upright, on getting back to Martha's boarding house where he could collapse in private. Martha was waiting on the porch, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral. "Well?" "Justified," Coleman said. "No charges." "Good. That means you can start paying rent." But she was smiling, small but genuine. "Also means you need to figure out what's next. Those children can't live in my hallway forever." "I know. There's a piece of land available. Old Peterson place east of town. House burned down last year, but the land's good. Owner's willing to sell cheap if someone will work it." Coleman looked at her. You've been planning this. Someone had to. You've been too busy dying and facing governors to think practical. Martha descended the steps, handed him another paper. I took the liberty of drawing up papers. You sign here, put down $30, the land's yours. Another $100 over the next year settles the debt. Martha, I don't have $30. I do. Consider it a loan. You pay me back when you can. She pressed the paper into his hand. Those children need a home, Mr. Briggs. You promised them one. Time to deliver. Coleman looked at the paper, at Martha's determined face, at Ethan and Lizzie standing beside him. A piece of land. A chance to rebuild. A future that wasn't running or hiding or fighting for survival. Why are you doing this? He asked Martha. Because 10 years ago, when my husband died, and I was about to lose this boarding house, someone gave me a chance. Let me work off my debts, gave me time to get on my feet. I swore if I ever had the opportunity, I'd pass it on. She met his eyes. Now I'm passing it to you. Don't waste it. Coleman took the paper, borrowed a pen from Sheriff Harlan, who'd followed them out, and signed. His hand shook slightly, making the signature messy, but it was legal, binding, real. We have land, he said, more to himself than anyone. We have dirt and grass, Ethan corrected. We need a house. Then we'll build one. You can barely stand. Then you'll do most of the work. Consider it education. Coleman smiled, despite exhaustion, despite pain. Your father was teaching you farming. I'll teach you building. Between the two of us, we'll figure it out. And me? Lizzie asked. You're the supervisor. Make sure we don't do anything stupid. She considered this seriously. That's going to be a full-time job. The next 3 months were the hardest work Coleman had ever done, and he'd fought through the war. His body was still healing, still weak, still prone to sudden pain that dropped him to his knees. But every morning, he'd wake in Martha's boarding house, eat the breakfast she'd prepared, and walk with the children to their land. The Peterson place was 40 acres of prairie grass and wildflowers, a creek running along the northern edge, a stand of cottonwoods providing shade and lumber. The burned remnants of the old house stood like a skeleton in the center, blackened timbers and a stone chimney that had survived the fire. We can use that, Coleman said, pointing at the chimney. Build around it. Save us having to construct a new one. They started with a temporary shelter canvas stretched over wooden frames enough to keep rain off while they worked. Then came the real building. Coleman taught Ethan how to fell trees, how to square logs, how to notch them for tight fitting. The boy learned fast, his remaining fingers adapting, finding new ways to grip and hold. The missing digits didn't slow him down as much as Coleman feared they might. Lizzie proved invaluable in ways Coleman hadn't expected. She had an eye for measurement, for making sure corners were square and walls were level. She'd stand back studying their work, then point out problems before they became serious. That beam's crooked, she'd say, and she'd be right. Townspeople helped. Some out of genuine kindness, others probably from curiosity or guilt. They'd appear with tools, with food, with advice. The sawmill owner donated lumber for the roof. The general store extended credit for nails and hinges. Martha brought meals 3 times a week, refusing payment, saying it was still part of the loan. Sheriff Harlan visited often, always with news. The territorial marshals had raided the Kansas City Trade Association offices, found evidence of a trafficking ring that spanned 3 territories. Dozens of children recovered, dozens of arrests made. The lawyers who'd opposed Coleman at the hearing were facing their own legal troubles, now their connections to the organization exposed. You did more than save 2 kids, Harlan said one afternoon watching Coleman and Ethan raise a wall frame. You broke open something that should have been stopped years ago. I just did what needed doing. That's what heroes always say. Harlan handed Coleman a letter. This came for you. Federal Marshal's Office. They're asking if you'd be willing to testify at the trials. Coleman read it, felt old instincts rising. The idea of going back, of facing those men in court, of reliving everything. I don't know. Think about it. Those children you helped recover, they need someone to speak for them. Someone who understands what it's like to stand against men like Garrett. Harlan tipped his hat. You've got time. Trials won't start for months. By late autumn, the house was standing. Small, simple, but solid. 3 rooms, one for Coleman, one for the children, one shared space for living and cooking. Wooden floors that creaked. Windows with real glass that Martha had somehow acquired. A porch where they could sit and watch the sun set over their land. Their land. The words still felt strange to Coleman. The night before they moved in, Coleman couldn't sleep. He walked the property under moonlight, running his hands along walls he'd built, standing in rooms that smelled like fresh-cut pine and possibility. He thought about his old cabin burned to ash, about the peace he'd tried to build there through isolation and silence. That peace had been fragile, false, dependent on the world leaving him alone. This was different. This peace was built on action, on choice, on standing up instead of hiding. It was harder, more complicated, more vulnerable to the world's chaos. But it was real in a way the other never had been. Mr. Briggs. Ethan stood in the doorway, silhouetted against lamplight from inside. The boy had grown over these months, filled out added muscle from the labor. He'd never be whole. The missing fingers, the scars, the memories would stay with him forever. But he was healing into someone stronger than the terrified child who'd stumbled bleeding onto a porch. Can't sleep, Coleman asked. Thinking about tomorrow, about living here, about what happens next. What do you want to happen next? Ethan was quiet, considering. I want to learn. Everything you know. About building, about fighting, about standing up when it's hard. I want to be someone who makes a difference, like you did. I'm not special, Ethan. I'm just a man who made a choice. That's what makes it matter. You weren't special. You weren't a hero. You were just a man who chose right when it would have been easier to choose wrong. Ethan moved to stand beside Coleman, looking out at their land. Lizzie and I, we talk about it sometimes, about what would have happened if you'd turned us away. If you'd decided we weren't your problem, we'd be dead or worse. Because no one else stood up. Just you. Coleman didn't know what to say to that. The weight of it, of being the difference between life and death for 2 children, was almost too much to carry. Your parents stood up first, Coleman said finally. They died protecting you. I just continued what they started. And we'll continue what you started. That's how it works, right? Good gets passed on person to person until maybe there's enough of it to actually change things. Maybe. Coleman put his hand on the boy's shoulder. Tomorrow we move in. Day after we start planting winter wheat. After that, we figure out the rest as we go. Sound good? Sounds like a plan. They stood together in the moonlight, looking at the house they'd built, at the future they'd carved from tragedy. Inside, Lizzie was probably asleep, dreaming whatever dreams 8-year-old girls had after surviving what she'd survived. Tomorrow, they'd wake in their own home, on their own land, free and safe and together. It wasn't the ending Coleman had expected when that bleeding boy stumbled onto his porch. But looking at Ethan now, seeing the strength building in him, seeing the future taking shape, Coleman realized it was better than anything he could have planned. Sometimes, the best things in life came from the hardest moments. Sometimes standing up when it was easier to hide led to something worth having. Sometimes losing everything meant finding something better. Coleman had lost his cabin, his solitude, his carefully constructed peace. He'd gained a family, a purpose, a reason to keep fighting. The trade seemed fair. Come on, he said to Ethan. Let's get some sleep. Big day tomorrow. They walked back inside together, closed the door on the night, and prepared for whatever came next. Together. The years moved like the seasons, each one bringing its own challenges and small victories. That first winter was brutal, temperatures dropping below zero, snow piling up past the windows, wind that cut through walls and found every gap in their construction. Coleman spent those dark months teaching the children everything he could remember from his own childhood, from the war, from 3 years of solitary living. How to preserve food. How to mend clothes. How to keep a fire burning through the night when fuel was scarce. Ethan absorbed it all with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was survival. He'd wake before dawn to help Coleman with chores, would sit up late reading books Martha loaned them from her personal collection. The boy's hand had healed as well as it could the stumps where his fingers had been forming calluses that let him grip tools in new ways. He'd never hold things the way he once had, but he adapted, improvised, found solutions. Lizzie was different. Quieter. She'd have nightmares sometimes, wake screaming about fire and men with torches. Coleman would sit with her in those dark hours, not saying much, just being present until the terror faded and she could sleep again. During the day, she was their anchor, keeping them organized, making sure they didn't forget the small details that made a house into a home. Fresh flowers in a jar on the table. Curtains she'd sewn herself. A cat she'd adopted from town that kept mice out of their stores. Spring came eventually, as it always did. They planted wheat like Coleman had promised, worked the 40 acres until Coleman's back screamed and Ethan's good hand was covered in blisters. The crop grew strong through summer, golden and heavy with grain. When harvest came, they worked alongside neighbors who'd come to help, who'd accepted them as part of the community. The yield was good enough to pay off half of Coleman's debt to Martha and stock their root cellar for the coming winter. "We're going to make it," Ethan said one evening, standing in their field with the sunset painting everything amber and gold. "We're actually going to make it." "Never doubted it," Coleman lied. He'd doubted it plenty during the worst of winter during planting, when nothing seemed to take, during the lean weeks when their food ran low, and he'd wondered if he'd saved these children only to watch them starve slowly. But they hadn't starved. They'd survived. More than survived, they'd built something. The letter from the federal marshal's office came again in October. Coleman had ignored the first three, but this one was different. More urgent. The trials were starting. Testimony was needed. The children recovered from the trafficking ring needed someone to speak for them to help the jury understand what they'd endured. Coleman read the letter twice, then handed it to Ethan. "What do you think?" The boy read it silently, his face unreadable. "They want you to go to Kansas City, to testify. For 3 weeks, maybe more. That's harvest season. We need you here." "I know." Ethan set the letter down, looked at Coleman directly. "But those other kids need you more, don't they?" Coleman had been hoping Ethan would give him an excuse to refuse to stay home to avoid reopening wounds that were finally starting to heal. Instead, the boy was doing what Coleman had taught him, seeing past his own needs to what was right. "Yeah," Coleman admitted. "They do." "Then you should go. Lizzie and I can handle the farm for a few weeks. Martha will check on us. Sheriff Harlan too. We'll be fine. You're 13 years old. I'm old enough. You taught me to be old enough." Ethan's jaw set in that stubborn way it did when he'd made a decision. "You stood up for us when no one else would. Now it's time to stand up for them. That's what you'd tell me to do if our situations were reversed." Coleman wanted to argue, wanted to find reasons why it was different, why he couldn't leave. But Ethan was right, and they both knew it. 3 weeks. I'll be back before first snow. We'll be here." Coleman left on a Monday morning, riding a horse borrowed from the livery, his rifle strapped to the saddle, and a bag of supplies Martha had insisted he take. Ethan and Lizzie stood in the yard watching him go, both trying to look brave, both failing slightly. Coleman made himself not look back. Looking back would make leaving impossible. Kansas City was bigger than Coleman remembered, sprawling and loud, and filled with people who moved too fast and talked too loud. The federal building where the trials were being held was impressive, stone and marble columns out front, everything designed to make people feel small and intimidated. Coleman felt both as he climbed the steps. The marshal who greeted him was a young man named Peters, efficient and serious. "Mr. Briggs, thank you for coming. We weren't sure you would." "Neither was I." Peters led him through corridors filled with lawyers and clerks and other people whose purpose Coleman couldn't guess. The trial's been going for 2 weeks. We've established the scope of the operation: 43 children recovered, 26 adults, arrested, evidence of activities spanning back at least 8 years. But the defense is claiming their clients didn't know what their employees were doing, that they ran a legitimate recovery service, and a few bad actors corrupted it. That's a lie. We know, but we need to prove it. That's where you come in. Peters stopped at a door, turned to face Coleman. Your testimony is crucial. You're the only person who fought Garrett directly, who saw how his operation worked, who can speak to the systematic nature of what was happening. But I need to warn you, the defense attorneys will come after you hard. They'll try to paint you as a vigilante, as someone who killed first and asked questions later. They'll question your motives, your judgment, everything. Let them. Peters studied Coleman's face, seemed satisfied with what he saw. The children you saved, Ethan and Lizzie, they're doing well. They're home, safe, growing up. Good. Because 20 other families are hoping to hear the same thing about their children, the ones we recovered. Your testimony might help make that possible. The courtroom was packed when Coleman was called to testify 2 days later. He walked to the witness stand, feeling every eye on him, sat in the chair that was too small and too exposed, and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor, a woman named Catherine Marsh, approached with a gentle smile. Mr. Briggs, thank you for being here. Can you tell the court about your first encounter with the defendant, Mr. Garrett? Coleman told it all. The boy bleeding on his porch, finding Lizzie by the creek, the confrontation at his cabin, the fire and the chase, and the final stand. He spoke clearly, precisely, leaving out nothing. Marsh walked him through it step by step, establishing timeline, establishing threat, establishing that Garrett had been operating a criminal enterprise with full knowledge of his employers. Then came the defense attorney, a man named Whitmore, who wore expensive suits and a practiced sneer. Mr. Briggs, you claim you acted in defense of these children. But isn't it true you had multiple opportunities to contact law enforcement instead of taking matters into your own hands? The nearest law enforcement was across a river while 5 armed men were hunting children. There wasn't time. There's always time to do things properly, Mr. Briggs, unless, of course, you simply wanted an excuse to kill someone. Objection. Marsh stood. Counsel is badgering the witness. Sustained, the judge said. Mr. Whitmore, keep your questions professional. Whitmore smiled, unbothered. Let me rephrase. You're a former military sharpshooter. You were trained to kill. Isn't it possible that when faced with a crisis, you reverted to what you knew best? Violence. I knew best how to survive. How to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. By killing 4 men. 4 men who, according to their employment records, were legally authorized recovery agents. Those records are falsified, like the contract claiming the Garver parents signed over their children. So you say, but you're not a handwriting expert, are you? You're not a legal expert. You're just a man who decided he knew better than the law and acted accordingly. Coleman felt anger building, pushed it down. Getting angry was what Whitmore wanted. I'm a man who saw children in danger and didn't look away. If that makes me a vigilante, then I'm a vigilante. And if those children hadn't been in danger, if Garrett was legitimate and you killed innocent men, they weren't innocent. I saw what they did. I saw the Garver farm burning. I saw Ethan's missing fingers. I saw Lizzie hiding in terror. Those aren't the actions of legitimate agents. But you didn't see the initial confrontation, did you? You didn't see what actually happened at the Garver farm. You only have the word of 2 traumatized children who might have misunderstood what they witnessed. I have the word of a 13-year-old boy who ran 5 miles with 3 wounds to save his sister. I have the word of an 8-year-old girl who hid alone in the dark because her brother told her to. Those children don't lie about watching their parents murdered. Whitmore paced his shoes, clicking on the marble floor. Let's talk about your own past, Mr. Briggs. You served in the war, yes. Saw combat, yes. Killed men, yes. How many? Marsh stood again. Relevance, Your Honor. I'm establishing the witness's history of violence. Whitmore said smoothly. Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Briggs. Coleman looked at the jury, at the faces watching him. I don't know. During the war, you shoot at positions, at uniforms, at movement. You don't count. You just survive. But you were good at it. A sharpshooter. Someone who killed from distance professionally, efficiently. Someone who protected his unit, who kept them alive. And after the war, you isolated yourself. Built a cabin far from civilization. That suggests someone running from something, doesn't it? Perhaps running from guilt. I was tired. The war was exhausting. I wanted peace. Or perhaps you knew you had a capacity for violence that made you dangerous. Perhaps you isolated yourself because you didn't trust yourself around people. Whitmore leaned closer. And then these children appeared, giving you an excuse to unleash that violence again, giving you a reason to kill that felt righteous. Coleman stood up so fast his chair crashed backward. Those children were being hunted by murderers. I stopped those murderers. If that's wrong, if protecting innocent lives is somehow evidence of my violent nature, then your whole legal system is broken. Mr. Briggs, sit down, the judge ordered. Coleman stayed standing. I came here to testify, to help other children like Ethan and Lizzie, to make sure the men who profited from trafficking and murder face consequences. But if this court is more interested in questioning my motives than prosecuting actual criminals, then maybe I'm wasting my time. Mr. Briggs, I killed 4 men. I'd do it again, because they deserved it, and because those children deserve to live. If that makes me a criminal in your eyes, then charge me. Otherwise, stop wasting this jury's time with implications and ask your real questions. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. Whitmore was objecting. Marsh was objecting to the objection, and Coleman just stood there, breathing hard, angry, in a way he hadn't been since the war. Finally, order was restored. The judge looked at Coleman with something that might have been respect or might have been exasperation. Mr. Briggs, you will control yourself, or I'll hold you in contempt. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Whitmore, do you have any further questions? Whitmore looked at Coleman, looked at the jury, seemed to calculate odds. No further questions. Coleman was dismissed. He walked out of the courtroom through the marble halls out into afternoon sunlight that felt too bright after the dimness inside. He'd probably hurt their case with that outburst. Probably made himself look exactly like the violent vigilante Whitmore was claiming he was. Marshal Peters found him sitting on the steps an hour later. That was interesting. I lost my temper. You spoke truth. The jury saw that. Peters sat beside him. The defense is trying to make this about you because they can't defend their client's actions. Every piece of evidence points to a systematic operation. Your testimony confirmed that Garrett operated with violence and false authority. That's all we needed. So the outburst didn't ruin everything. Actually, it might have helped. The jury saw someone who cares deeply about protecting children. Someone willing to fight for what's right even when it costs him. That plays well. Peters stood, offered Coleman a hand up. Deliberations start tomorrow. You're free to go home. We'll send word when there's a verdict. Coleman took the hand. Let Peters pull him up. The children you recovered, are they okay? Most of them. Some have families to return to. Others don't. We're working on placements on finding homes. It's complicated. If any of them need... Coleman stopped, unsure what he was offering. I don't have much. Just a farm and a house barely big enough for 3. But if there's a child who needs a place who has nowhere else... Peters looked at him for a long moment. I'll keep that in mind. And Mr. Briggs, thank you for coming, for testifying, for giving a damn when most people wouldn't. The ride home took 3 days. Coleman pushed hard, sleeping rough, eating jerky and hardtack, wanting only to be back on his land with his children. He arrived on a Thursday evening just as sun was setting, and he could see smoke rising from their chimney, warm and welcoming. Ethan was in the yard splitting wood when Coleman rode up. The boy dropped the axe, ran to meet him, grabbed the horse's bridle. You're back early. We weren't expecting you for another week. testified faster than they thought. How are things here? Good. Wheat's mostly harvested. Lizzie's been canning vegetables. Martha brought over a chicken that won't stop laying eggs. We're managing. Coleman dismounted, felt his legs nearly give out after 3 days of riding. Ethan caught his arm, steadied him. You look exhausted. Long trip. Long few weeks. Coleman looked at the house, at the lamplight in the windows, at Lizzie's face appearing in the doorway. But I'm home now. They walked inside together. Lizzie had cooked stew, and the house smelled like meat and herbs and home. Coleman sat at their table, ate food prepared by these children he'd saved, and who'd saved him in return, and felt something settle in his chest. Peace, maybe. Real peace this time, earned through fire and blood, and choosing right over easy. Tell us about the trial, Lizzie said. Did you help them? I hope so. Won't know for sure until the jury decides. They'll decide right, Ethan said with certainty. Because you told the truth. Truth wins. Coleman wanted to believe that, wanted to trust that justice would prevail, that the men who'd profited from trafficking children would face consequences. But he'd seen too much of the world to be that naive. Sometimes truth won. Sometimes it didn't. All you could do was tell it and hope. The verdict came 3 weeks later, delivered by a rider from town. Guilty on all counts. The men who'd employed Garrett, who'd funded his operations, who'd sold children for profit, all of them convicted. Sentences ranging from 20 years to life. The operation was dismantled, the trafficking ring broken. Sheriff Harlan brought the news personally, riding out to the farm with a bottle of whiskey and a satisfied smile. Thought you'd want to know. Your testimony was cited specifically in the verdict. Jury said it proved systematic intent, proved the defendants knew exactly what they were funding. Coleman took the news quietly, nodded, accepted the whiskey, but didn't drink much. The children they recovered. What happens to them now? Most are being returned to families. Some are being placed with new ones. A few. Harlan paused. There's a boy, about Lizzie's age. No family, no home. Been through things worse than what you're two experienced. Social services is trying to find placement, but it's hard. Most people don't want children that damaged. Coleman knew what Harlan was asking without asking. What's the boy's name? Thomas? Tommy. He doesn't talk much. Hasn't said a word since we recovered him. Bring him here. Harlan blinked. Just like that. Just like that. If he needs a home, he's got one. If he needs time to heal, we'll give him time. If he needs people who understand what he's been through, we understand. Coleman looked at his house, at his land, at the life he'd built from ashes. We've got room for one more. Tommy arrived a week later, small and silent and terrified of everything. He wouldn't sleep in the house, couldn't stand being enclosed. Ethan set up a tent in the yard, and the boy slept there even when autumn turned cold. He wouldn't eat with them at first, would only take food if they left it outside and walked away. He'd flinch at sudden movements, would disappear for hours into the fields or the woods. Give him time, Coleman told Ethan and Lizzie when they worried. He's been hurt worse than we can imagine. Time and patience and showing him he's safe, that's all we can do. Lizzie took the lead somehow, understanding what Tommy needed in ways Coleman couldn't. She'd sit near the tent and read aloud, not expecting response, just filling the silence with stories. She'd leave drawings for him to find pictures of the farm, of the animals, of the 4 of them together. Slowly, incrementally, Tommy started emerging. First just watching from a distance, then sitting nearby while they worked. Then one morning, helping Ethan carry water from the creek. The first word he spoke 3 months after arriving was safe. Coleman had been showing him how to mend a fence when Tommy touched the wood, ran his fingers over the solid rails, and whispered, "Safe." "Yeah," Coleman said, keeping his voice steady despite the tightness in his throat. "You're safe here. We all are." Winter came again, their second on the land, and this time they were ready. Food-stored wood stacked the house weatherproofed against the cold. Tommy still slept in his tent most nights, but he'd come inside for meals now, would sit with them in the evenings while Coleman read or Ethan practiced writing or Lizzie sewed. He didn't talk much, but he was present. He was healing. Spring brought changes. Ethan turned 14, tall and broad-shouldered, more man than boy. He'd taken to reading law books that Martha loaned him, talking about maybe becoming a lawyer someday, someone who could fight for people through the system instead of around it. Lizzie was 10 and fierce, already better at managing the farm's accounts than Coleman. And Tommy, still silent more than not, had started drawing incredible detailed sketches of birds and trees and the people who'd given him a second chance at life. Coleman watched them grow, watched them heal, watched them become people who'd survived terrible things and chosen not to let those things define them. He thought about the man he'd been 3 years ago, isolated and bitter, convinced that peace required separation from humanity's darkness. That man had been wrong. Real peace, lasting peace, came from standing in the darkness and fighting it, from taking broken things and helping them become whole. One evening in late May, sitting on the porch with all 3 children, Coleman felt that peace settle over him like a benediction. The farm was thriving, the children were healthy, the world beyond their 40 acres kept turning, kept producing tragedy and injustice and pain. But here in this small corner they'd carved out and defended, there was something good. "Thank you," Ethan said suddenly, quietly, into the comfortable silence. "For what?" Coleman asked. "For standing your ground that night. For not hiding us. For fighting when you didn't have to." Ethan gestured at the farm, at his siblings, at everything they'd built. "For all of this." Coleman wanted to say it wasn't necessary, that he'd just done what anyone would do. But that would be a lie. Most people wouldn't have done what he did. Most people would have hidden, would have protected themselves, would have let the world's darkness swallow 2 more children because it was safer and easier. "You would have done the same," Coleman said instead. "If our positions were reversed, I know you would have." "Maybe, but I learned it from you. How to stand up. How to fight for what's right even when it's hard. We all learned it from you." Ethan looked at Lizzie and Tommy, at the family they'd become. "You saved us that night. Now we'll spend the rest of our lives saving others. That's how it works, right? Good gets passed on." Coleman thought about the boy bleeding on his porch, begging him to hide his sister. Thought about the choice he'd made, not to hide, but to stand. Thought about all the ways that single decision had rippled outward, creating consequences he couldn't have predicted. Children saved. Criminals prosecuted. A trafficking ring dismantled. A family built from survivors and stubbornness, and refusing to let evil win. "Yeah," Coleman said, watching the sun set over their land, over their home, over the future they'd fought for and won. "That's exactly how it works." Years later, long after Ethan had become the lawyer he'd dreamed of being, fighting for children in courtrooms across the territory, after Lizzie had opened a school that taught orphans and survivors, after Tommy had spoken his full story through art that moved people to tears and action, after Coleman's hair had gone gray, and his body had finally surrendered to age and old wounds, people would ask how it all started. The answer was always the same. It started with a choice. A single choice to stand instead of hide, to fight, instead of turn away, to risk everything for children who weren't his, but became his anyway. That choice had cost him his old life, his cabin, his carefully constructed isolation. It had nearly cost him his life, but it had given him something worth infinitely more: a family, a purpose, a legacy of standing up when others wouldn't. Coleman Briggs had been a soldier once, trained to kill, numbed by war. Then he'd been a recluse, hiding from the world's pain. But in the end, when it mattered most, he'd been exactly what those children needed him to be: a man who didn't hide, who didn't run, who stood his ground and fought. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because it was right. Because sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stand between evil and innocence and refuse to move. That night changed everything. And everything that came after: the family, the peace, the good that rippled outward from one man's decision, proved that standing up mattered, that one person could make a difference, that choosing courage over comfort could change not just lives, but the world itself. Coleman never regretted it. Not once. not even at the end. Because he'd learned the most important lesson the war had failed to teach him, that real peace isn't found in silence and isolation, but in fighting for those who can't fight for themselves and standing when others won't, in being the person you needed when you were at your darkest. He stood. He fought. And in standing and fighting, he found redemption purpose and a peace more real than any he'd imagined possible.